Hey everybody, I'm Brad, aka Shambazzle Games, and today we have a special feature for you covering all the harvested secrets we were able to pull forth from Larian Studios' gameplay reveal and demo of Baldur's Gate 3 at Pax East today. Now, we knew Larian Studios was going to do our beloved D&D justice, but the reveal today at PAX East shows what I believe to be a perfect marriage between the RPG cinematics and intuitive design and great storytelling we've come to know and expect from the Divinity Original Sin series, with the core experience and raw ingredients that make up our Dungeons & Dragons role-playing game. So this is everything I was able to harvest from the gameplay and demo presentation at PAX East today, with a comprehensive breakdown of things that weren't necessarily said in the demo but were shown. So I'll start with a complete rundown of everything I was able to Sherlock out of the content, and later I'll upload another video with a complete narration of everything we were able to pull from the actual footage itself. So here we go! Now, right off the bat, players will have the opportunity to either create a custom ground-up hero of your own, or play through one of the origin story characters, much like we've seen in Divinity Original Sin, complete with races and sub-race options. So we saw elves and we saw high elves, we saw dwarves and we saw hill dwarves, we saw halflings and lightfoot halflings. There are going to be those sub-race options in-game. At launch, or at least for early access, there are going to be 6 character classes available, including Wizard, Cleric, Ranger, Fighter, Rogue, and Warlock. Then from Larian Studios said they're going to continue to develop these and add more classes through development up to and after early access. In addition, we also saw subclass options. We saw Trickery Domain and Life Domain clerics in the character creation process. We also saw Fiend Pack Warlocks that suggest absolutely subclass options will be available to players. From there, you can not only choose your ability points, your strength, dexterity, constitution, wisdom, intelligence, and charisma, but you can also choose what skills you're proficient with. The familiar flavors of arcana, religion, history, investigation, intimidation, and of course, persuasion for the bards. If you want to go with something a little pre-baked, you can choose at early access from 5 origin characters that include a Githyanki fighter named Lae'zel, Gale, who's a wizard, Shadowheart, who's a trickery cleric. We have Will, the Fiend Pact Warlock, and Astarion, the Vampire-kin rogue. So on that note, there also seem to be some less traditional and newer race options like half vampire, I think it was called, or Vampire-kin. So this led me to wonder if there are going to be other new races or more obscure fringe races available in the game. In addition to confirming that sub-races are in the game, the demo also confirmed that 5e backgrounds are going to be available to select: your charlatan, your nobles, your outcasts, all the goods from the 5e manual there. And there's also the option, of course, to add on your own written origin or background into the story. So the opening scene begins with a large, sort of ominous-looking mind flayer or illithid walking through the bridge of, or rather the cavern-esque kind of room. And in this room there are cells, these organic, very alien capsules that are all holding humanoids of various races, shapes, and sizes. And we later find that this is actually aboard a nautiloid, which are the organic astral planar faring ships commanded by the illithid. They look like, a nautilus, which is like a shell with those weird tentacly shellfish things, but flying and traveling the planes, obviously. So nautiloids are these motherships that the illithid use to traverse from plane to plane and act on their devilish means and capture and assimilate humanoids from other planes and worlds. So now as the Nautilus descends on the scene of a city called Yartar, which is east of Waterdeep on the Sword Coast, it's not Baldur's Gate and it's not Waterdeep, contrary to popular belief. It begins to lay waste to the town, crushing and capsizing buildings, and of course teleporting these humanoids up from the ground into the ship and into these capsules to be assimilated by the evil illithid. Now, the process whereby illithid assimilate humanoid races is called seromorphosis or seromorphosis, depending on who you ask. And we actually see this in stirring detail as little tadpoles are plucked from an incubation pool and inserted in through the eyes of their captive victims. I still can't get it out of my head. So, I don't know if you're watching the footage. I guess viewer discretion advised. But additionally, we see a lot of dead husks of Illithid lying around, and some of them propped up against these chambers. I'm not really sure what that's about. Quickly into the opening sequence, a portal opens in the sky over Yartar, and Githyanki Dragon Knights begin to emerge through and start to attack the Illithid Nautiloid ship. Githyanki are sworn enemies of the Illithid. In fact, for Githyanki warriors, raiding the strongholds of Mind Flayers or Illithid are considered a rite of passage. So the Dragon Riders start to attack this ship, and I'm thinking it's possible that the reason they might be tracking the ship is because of the Githyanki captive we see in the opening scene, who we know is the actual origin character, Lae'zel, the Githyanki warrior. So I wonder if there's some tie into the story there. And anyway, the Dragon Riders are clearly no fan of the Illithid. They attack the ship, and eventually the ship goes through teleport to teleport, crashing into this snowy wasteland. We don't know where it is, another world, another plane, it could be anywhere. At this point, the ship explodes, and presumably the character tutorial kicks in. Now, Sven and the crew opted to forego the tutorial in the interest of getting us into the first part of the story in the gameplay demo, but he did note that early access could come within the next couple of months, with the proviso that they'll release it for EA when they're satisfied that all the main bugs are worked out. So sometime in the next couple of months, we're going to start to see early access come available. They also mentioned later in the Q&A that the only platforms they're talking about for release right now are Google Stadia and PC. Moving on, Sven went on to say that the tutorial, however, does cover the recovery and teleport of this broken Illithid ship in support of the Githyanki warrior Lae'zel to a place called Faerun, he says, which to me suggests that wherever you start is not in the world of Faerun. Now, we know that Githyanki and Illithid are both astral planar travelers, so it's very possible that these could span worlds, or at least where you begin in the game is not necessarily where you start in the tutorial. So you teleport to a place called Faerun, and that's where the gameplay tutorial begins. Now, what we notice right off the bat is there's a very point-and-click third-person RPG element to it. Sven also says that you can also play it in more of a real-time controlled third-person gameplay experience. In addition to that, we see the standard fare of loot, garbage loot, usable loot, food, things like that. So presumably rations and sustenance are going to be part of the mechanics. Shortly into the tutorial, we see the companion system come to life, which is very much like we've seen in Divinity Original Sin 2, which is a great thing. When we meet our first companion, the trickery domain cleric Shadowheart. Shadowheart talks about the larvae from the Illithid, calls them tadpoles, I guess as they're referred to in the early stage of the game, and that both characters have had these tadpoles implanted behind their eyes, which are slowly going to fester, dominate, and turn those individuals into mind flayers themselves. So we see this connectivity between the characters through the power of these parasites, and they also give the characters some otherwise unavailable features, like for our half-vampire kin, the ability to exist and walk in daylight. There are lots of dialogue choices, at least 5 we've seen in every sequence. Very open RPG-style responses that allow you to directly impact the story and control the flow of where your character's narrative is or are going. And we see that while not all PC voices are indefinitely voiced, the NPC responses seem to be completely VO, which is really nice. So everything fully voiced increases the immersion and lends to that buy-in that you're participating in this story. So the story kicks off after these two parties agree that their primary objective is to seek a way to survive the endless wastes in time to find a cleric who can help rid them of these unwelcome parasites. Of course, dialogue decisions can certainly impact who you stay with, who accompanies you, and who you leave behind in the story, and how your personal story will play out. Shortly thereafter, we see the first combat encounter. Now, combat encounter mechanics are almost, very much like Divinity Original Sin 2. In fact, I would say exactly like Divinity, but with very exclusive characteristics of D&D combat. There are like high ground gains advantage, which is confirmed in the demo. Sven also says that advantage gives you the opportunity to roll 2d20. So they're really tying it back to the core 5e mechanics. Advantage is in game and it does play out just like advantage, or as Sven says in the demo, allows you to roll twice. You can open the combat log to review the analytics and the metrics behind everything that happens in game. So our min-maxers will be happy with that, as well as people who really like to optimize their builds and characters for maximum damage, survivability, healing capability, or whatever you like in your party. So through the log, we see familiar spells like Sacred Flame, Guiding Bolt. We see radiant damage registering in the combat log. We also see Shield of Faith. We see Mage Hand, and we see actual damage types like slashing, bludgeoning, and piercing. Lots of great familiar D&D 5e standards for the Dungeons & Dragons aficionados and the gaming aficionados in the crew alike. Altogether, looks very clean with fluid collision dynamics and effects, great HUD feedback, scrolling numbers that you can control the density or sparsity of, which is really solid, I think, for a beta game. And overall, the whole thing looked super solid for a game that's not even really hit early access or pre-alpha yet. We also saw the implementation of core D&D mechanics like reaction and opportunity attacker in the game. They're in play, and it really does feel like Divinity Original Sin 2 with D&D core mechanics laying over. So really happy to see that. Divinity, of course, being heralded as one of the greatest RPG adventure games of all time. Great bones to lay the world's greatest role-playing game over, if you ask me. Bonus action and disengage are also featured in the demo, which shows that the 5e action economy plays out in combat just like it would at the table. So that includes your movement, action, bonus action, and reaction. Additionally, there are some new flavor effects added, like the Mage Hand we saw in use actually is capable of throwing a target, which you know is not necessarily possible in rules as written, and knocks a character prone. So I guess where they have things like that, that's where we saw some liberty taken to improve, I guess, or increase the video gamification of the tabletop mechanics. Saving throws are in the game. We saw several times where characters were either traversing difficult terrain or reacting to spells that they were affected by, showing red saving throw if you failed or green if you were successful. And elemental damage and synergy seems to be in the game, akin to what we see in Divinity, where you can take a pitch of oil, light it on fire, create a wealth of flames in the field, and then extinguish that fire to create vapor and obscure vision. All these became really almost scientific and surgical combat tactics in Divinity, and it looks like those are going to feature in Baldur's Gate 3 as well. Death saves are in the game. When a character falls unconscious, you can see them starting to make death saves with the traditional mechanics of if they're hit while they're down, they suffer 2 death saves. After 3 failed death saves, they are dead. Or after 3 successful death saves, they can be stabilized. Character permadeath is also in the game, wherein if your character suffers damage more than negative their maximum hit points, they are insta-dead. And additionally, critical hit and critical miss characteristics are in the game too. We saw a moment where a critical hit was executed against an enemy, and there was this really cool fly around death cam action sequence that played out. Very excited to see how that goes throughout the whole game. Now, in the beginning combat sequence, they were fighting mind or intellect devourers. And in the second dialogue sequence, Shadowheart, the trickery cleric, discusses their chase through hell that they just experienced in the previous opening sequence. That to me suggests that when they were teleporting through plane to plane chasing the Nautiloid, as the Githyanki Dragon Knights were in pursuit, they may have traversed over a number of planes before they got to that end sequence that leads us into the game. So definitely some theory crafting room in play there. She also openly refers to the Illithid parasite as a Mind Flayer tadpole or an Illithid tadpole, so that's what they're calling them in the game. Sneak and stealth mechanics are in the game. You can also use environmental effects to empower or change the effects of your weapon. For example, you can dip your arrows in a lit flame or a brazier or a torch to add fire damage to that weapon and then fire it. And you can actually enter turn-based sequences out of combat, which allows you to time and manipulate intricate combat tactics or pre-combat tactics, like setting up surprise, sneaking around environment, slowing down the action so you can get into the real core mechanics of these very intricate RPG and TTRPG-like dynamics. In this, we saw Sven talk about the 6-second round, which means that they're actually bringing that turn-based timing from D&D 5e into the game as well. We also saw in a moment where the script was visible, unintentionally so, for Shield of Faith, which tells us that concentration mechanics are at play for spellcasters. You can also move objects in the environment like you can in Divinity Original Sin, so you can throw crates or vases at your enemies. You can stack crates to create a staircase or makeshift staircase to get to unreachable areas, things like that, to use in creative ways. Also, be warned, friendly fire is very much at play. We saw Sven nearly one-shot his own party member. And apparently they will have appropriate reactions in the final build of the game. So don't hit your friends. Jump mechanics are also in play, which even uses space as a determining factor to see whether and how far you can jump. And skill checks and roll results are very much implemented in the game in a both passive and active iteration. So as you're walking through the terrain, we saw passive nature rolls and perception rolls being made, succeeded and failed on. Additionally, we also saw the character's ability to constitute those checks where needed or desired, like investigation or active perception or persuasion in dialogue. To that end, there are also a number of free action type movements available to characters, which include things like throw, jump, help, shove, dash, and we saw all these in play in the demo. And one thing I found really interesting about the dialogue responses is that they're all written in the past tense, as though you're playing through in real time a story that's already happened. For example, the character would say something like, I asked where she wanted to go, rather than what we typically see, which is something like, ask where she wants to go. So it actually gives you the literature that you would perform in that moment as though it had happened in the past, if that makes sense. The end result is a really interesting narrative, story-driven feel that gives you the sense that either you're playing in a true narration of an epic, or that the tutorial actually takes place in a flashback. I guess we'll have to wait and see to confirm that. Now, the dialogue, scenes, and the cinematics are also delivered in first-person past tense. For example, the character says, I had a great amount of trouble sleeping that night, rather than some overarching narration saying you have trouble or fitful sleep that night. And it seems very retrospective and introspective at the same time, which is a nice touch. The dialogues, like I said, bring skill checks into play. So we saw the PC rolling an actual visual D20 against a DC to perform these checks. And we saw charisma check skills in those dialogue, particularly like intimidation, persuasion, deception, and insight. Choosing different characters will have an effect on the different options you have in dialogue and the different story-based elements that are at play for each individual origin character. Probably goes without saying, but experience mechanics are in, of course. You gain experience as you work through the game, and that's how you level. Now, like I said, sneak mechanics and stealth mechanics definitely use shadow and obscured areas to work and determine the success rate of that action. So if you are stealthing through a heavily obscured area, you're going to be a little bit more successful and harder to identify than if you're trying to sneak or run past a cleared area or a lightly obscured area. We saw the elemental combat in play where Sven had lit up a pitch with fire and then used water to douse it out, creating this vaporous wall to obscure vision so he could stealth into different areas of a dungeon. We saw buff indicators over the character portraits and frames to show you what spells are in effect on your character or companions. We saw, like I said, charisma checks and skill checks at play in dialogue sequences. We saw sustained effects and concentration spells, like I mentioned. Now, in combat, most notably, we saw a character cast Witch Bolt and actually channel that Witch Bolt through combat as it was circulating around initiative. Initiative also very much in play, with an interstitial window that shows where you rolled versus your enemies before combat plays out. It's a lot more faster and fluid than at the tabletop, fortunately, I'll give you that. But those concentration spells have to be maintained, and just like in the tabletop game, if they're damaged, they suffer a check against concentration. If they lose concentration, the spell discontinues. Like I mentioned, the critical hit animation and finishers are really cool to see. There's a shared inventory between characters and companions, which is a nice little hack. I hope they keep that in, which means no matter where you are in the world, as long as you're in a party with characters, you can swap inventory back and forth. It's handy from time to time if your dead companion has a healing potion and your living companions need it because, well, they can't take it with them, can they? Difficult terrain is in. We saw that causing some strategic elements around movement and battlefield command. We saw spell scrolls as consumables. We saw that multiplayer is in. Sven mentioned that multiplayer is definitely going to be in at launch. And the beautiful thing about multiplayer, much like we see in Divinity, is you can enter someone else's story, see how their decisions have shaped the story in a different way, play through different origin characters without affecting your own progression in your own home game, let's say. As we said, initiative is not only in, but surprise guarantees that you go first in initiative, mimicking the surprise mechanics of D&D 5e. The first dungeon that we saw at the end of the gameplay tutorial was a really great looking delve. Here's a little nerd fact. The banners that you saw in the dungeon were all sporting the eyes of Selûne. So presumably this is some kind of abandoned temple to the moon goddess. And the dungeons just look so cool. Like, you've got Divinity Original Sin mechanics, this beautiful fluid RPG gameplay, and the dungeons element of Dungeons and Dragons coming together at this beautiful merging point. Oh, I can't wait to play this game. There are enemy line of sight items like Divinity Original Sin 2. Sneak attack came up, and we noticed therein that damage is actually registered by their dice mechanics. So sneak attack gives 1d6, or at least at this level it does. So they're not just leaving it to some abstract algorithm to determine the outcomes of these effects. They're actually using the dice mechanics that are attached to the role-playing game and the 5th edition Dungeons and Dragons rule set. You can use the environment strategically to your advantage, which has this really cool element and nuanced customization of things. You can snuff out torches in the distance to create shadows for your other party members to sneak through. You can knock things over to trigger or arm or disarm traps and lead your enemies into them. Lots of great creative ways to use the environment to create those opportunities. There's also turn-based mode that you can turn on and navigate those traps and kind of slow down time a little bit, if you will. And of course, what we saw, the most important rule that we know in every tabletop game: never split the party. You'll have to watch the gameplay to know what I mean there. Enemies will actually, AI and enemies will actually equip themselves and use objects in the environment at launch to help give them creative problem-solving skills in combat and shake things up for the players. There are lots of environmental shortcuts and secrets. Oh, so many secrets in the game. It's going to be amazing. And in Sven's own word, exploration is heavily rewarded. Of course, as exploration, one of the 3 main pillars of Dungeons and Dragons, the others being combat and roleplay, all very well represented in Larian Studios' offering of Baldur's Gate 3 from what we saw at Pax East today. From the Q&A, we discovered a little bit more about the game. You can modify the dice, and advantages confirmed. Sven says it sounds like there's a raw version and modifications of the difficulty for various user skill levels. He said these versions were straight out of the book, which to me says that there might be like a rules as written version and maybe a house ruled or modified version to adjust the difficulty slider on the game overall. We also learned from the Q&A that you can modify companions' ability points. You can change their skill points, but he couldn't or wouldn't confirm if you can modify their class leaning or subclass options, or whether that'll be in for launch. He confirmed that long rest and short rest mechanics are in the game. They were going to go through a camp scenario that's available in the game, and things like spell slots that only come back after a long rest. So long rest, short rest are going to be there for us. Like I said, they've only confirmed, or rather the only platforms they're talking about right now are Google Stadia and PC, but I can't imagine any iteration of this that isn't rolled out for PS and Xbox as well. Combat will always be turn-based in the game, confirmed in the Q&A. Also that alignment is less pronounced in 5e and therefore toned down by direction of wizards. So we've repeatedly heard this from Wizards, and it's no great secret that in 5e alignment features less than previous editions of 5e, and it looks like that's been carried through into this game. However, they did say that moral leaning and activities will have implications on your companions and interactions that you have. So honestly, this is kind of like my take for alignment in 5e. I don't really lean too far or put too much stock in alignment hard, but I do play out the impact of moral implications of actions and reactions. Finally, on the question of early access, Sven specifically said a number of times that they will roll out early access when all these major bugs are eliminated. He said there will be enough content to enjoy, but not too much that you can play through it and have nothing else to do at launch. I'm sure there's going to be a ton of content. If you play Divinity, there's no question or fear there. I will be all over this thing. And if you will too, I hope you join me. If you like the video, you like the breakdown, please give a small-time content creator a boost. Throw me a like, subscribe. I'd love to hear in the comments what you picked up out of the gameplay reveal. And of course, be sure to check out the next video, which is a narrated walkthrough of everything we actually pulled in real time from the demo. So until then, I'm Shambazla Games. Follow me on Twitter at Shambazla Games. Like, subscribe, comment, and stay close. We're going to have lots of this stuff come down to the pipe. And yeah, get at me on Twitter. Talk to you soon. Peace.